This audiobook is a member of the Witness to History series. It is entitled The Tragic Truth About the FDR Era, Volume A, FDR's Rise to the Presidency. It was recorded on February 11, 1976, by Colonel Curtis B. Dall and Dr. Peter BETER. Colonel Dall shares with Dr. BETER, and with you, rare and often stunning personal close-ups of the personality, family, and presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was Colonel Dall's father-in-law. He also draws upon the lessons of a remarkable business career, ranging from the top echelons of Wall Street, where, for example, he was once a partner in the firm known today as Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith, to the founding of what is today one of America's best-known major companies. His accomplishments are rendered even more amazing by the fact that he served a total of more than 13 years in voluntary military service, leading to the rank he now holds in the retired Air Force Reserve. He is also the author of several books, including FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law, and Warlords of Washington, and is well known for his patriotic activities, for which he has been honored with a number of awards. He is joined in this discussion by Dr. Peter BETER, who is no stranger to audiobook listeners. Dr. BETER has recorded 4 previous audiobook talking tapes and is heard monthly throughout the United States and in several foreign countries by means of his unique monthly audio letter. He is widely known as the man who opened Fort Knox in 1974, as well as for his numerous advance revelations of major economic and political developments based on confidential information sources in intelligence, business, and finance. He is listed in Who's Who in the East and other biographical reference works, and has written several books, including the nonfiction bestseller, The Conspiracy Against the Dollar, published by George Baziller in 1973.
Colonel Dall, it's indeed an honor to be here with you today to discuss one of the most important topics in the history of the United States, the role of your father-in-law, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his impact on the present as well as the past and future course of our nation. In our discussion today, February 11, 1976, I believe our listeners should be given a personal evaluation of the significance of the Roosevelt era. And as you know, it has been virtually impossible to have this evaluation because the data has been carefully hidden in family records and hasn't been made available for the general public. Since you were a part of this Roosevelt-Delano family, we are indeed privileged to be able to record today an oral history of a very important part of the history of our nation.
Dr. BETER, I appreciate very much the opportunity of exchanging ideas on very important topics with you. I am flattered that you want to ask my personal opinions, most of which I have never discussed before with the public, but I feel that in our challenging days which are upon us here, it is important for the American people to understand some of the problems which they have not effectively understood or solved in the past, and I am very delighted to have this opportunity to exchange ideas with you this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, Colonel. I know there are those apologists of the New Deal who will ask, why bring up the New Deal at this time? After all, it's been dead for so many years. But the point is, it's not dead. We are about to see it resurrected by Nelson Rockefeller, one of the original key New Dealers, and only he will call it by another name very shortly, the New Balance, or some sort of euphemistic name. On the topic of FDR, the American public falls into 2 large groups. There are those who consider him a hero, a savior if you please, and then there are those who strongly dislike him as being deceptive, treacherous, dishonest, and serving his own personal interests. I think that the best way we can begin is to ask, how did you first come to know FDR?
Dr. BETER, I first heard about FDR in an article at which time he was running for vice president with Mr. Cox as president on the Democratic ticket in 1920. And I recall seeing a picture of him standing there with a rifle in his hand. For what purpose I do not know, because he had a stiff collar on and a stick pin in his tie. And I couldn't figure out, but somebody said, well, Mr. Roosevelt, you've got to get some sort of a gimmick to make you a little folksy. That's the first time I ever even heard of his name, but I got to know him later on, as I will develop with you in due course.
Well, then getting to the lady that you married, Anna, the daughter, when did you first meet her, Colonel?
Well, Dr. BETER, I met Anna at a dinner party at the home of friends of mine, Mr. and Mrs. Walter Douglas, in their Fifth Avenue home in New York in 1924. Around Christmas time, before a dance. And Anna and Kay Douglas, the daughter of Walter Douglas, who was then the president of the Southern Pacific Railway, they were classmates and schoolmates in Miss Chapin's school. And at the dance I enjoyed later on, and one thing led to another, and then I was invited to a house party at Anna's grandmother's, Mrs. James Roosevelt's home in Hyde Park, and we had a very nice weekend up there, and several months later we became engaged, and following June we were married. At Hyde Park.
But had you not met FDR before that?
No, I had not, Dr. BETER.
I see, and
I met him up there at his mother's home when he came to dinner in a wheelchair. I was rather touched by his appearance because his eyes were wistful, and he had to be wheeled in by an attendant. He joined in the conversation, and I immediately became attached to him, and I was quite touched by his courage in trying to overcome his disability. When I went to see him about a couple of months later at his office at the Fidelity Deposit Company for luncheon, I was impressed with all the naval pictures that he had around his desk, and he had our luncheon brought in on the tray by a waiter, and we discussed World War I, and I told him that I had been a very unimportant ensign in the Naval Aviation Forces overseas, but I had volunteered, and he asked me a lot of questions because I had served under an old friend of his, Zachary Lansdowne, who was then a commander at the forces at Gibraltar, and I had served prior to the armistice with the Royal Naval Forces at Howden, East Yorkshire, in their balloon forces. We had a patrol in the North Sea. And he asked me a lot of questions, and we got along fine.
Do you recall, Colonel, some of the questions that FDR asked you at that time?
Well, not very many, Dr. BETER. It was largely, shall I say, small talk about his going overseas at that time with Woodrow Wilson and the George Washington and the peace conference at Versailles, and he asked me if I'd seen Commander Lansdowne recently, and I said no, I hadn't, and unfortunately the commander was burned up in that terrible accident at the Shenandoah.
Did he ever work in Wall Street, Colonel?
Well, Wall Street, Dr. BETER, is a general term. He was a vice president of the Fidelity Deposit Company, which is the big casualty insurance company with its main office in Baltimore, Maryland, and he was, from a titular point of view, he was in charge of their New York office, but due to his physical condition, he only went there occasionally, but his name was very valuable in the bonding business. And he used to go down to Wall Street occasionally, I would say, but prior to his getting the attack of infantile paralysis that happened, he used to go down there, and he was interested in law more than finance, but he became involved in several deals down there, and several of which I didn't think very much of.
Was he a good stock man or a good stock dealer?
No, I would say absolutely not. FDR's knowledge on money was very limited. Very limited indeed. But he had a good law background, and I presume that he could write a pretty good legal paper, although I think he's sloughed off most of this to his partners.
As I understand it, he didn't like law. He liked to create law, work on law, and create it, but never follow the law.
Or perhaps manufacture his own law in political areas if the case warranted.
Because later on, when he did become president, he was always very happy when he signed legislation. He said to the effect, "Now I'm creating law."
That's right. I think he remembered the maxim that we could apply to Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi.
Translating, Colonel, meaning the state is me.
That's right. It's an exaggerated form of egotism.
Are you saying that FDR was an egotist?
Extremely so, Dr. BETER.
I see. Now, I noticed that you bowed out of the family in the summer of 1933. Can you tell us why that was?
Well, that's a lot of things happened, Dr. BETER, between 1924 and 1933. Historically, politically, economically in this country. You remember that we had the initiation of an enormous panic in the fall of 1929, where a lot of us in Wall Street lost a great deal of money. And we had the political rise at the same time, coincidentally, with the rise of FDR at that time, at the suggestion of Al Smith and some of his associates to have him run for governor, which he did and was elected. And from that time on, his star as a political figure rose, and my situation in Wall Street reflected the devastation and the decline and the panic prices that the panic brought upon us, which is duly inflicted upon us by international interests. So when FDR moved on down to Washington, why things changed, and some of his associates, very high associates and friends, like Louis McHenry Howe and Felix Frankfurter, who didn't particularly like me, why it caused a parting of the ways, and unfortunate, I think, that the situation occurred because I did not go along with some of the things that I saw in the White House at very close range.
So then, after that, you only came back to the White House on weekends.
That's about right. I was very busy in Wall Street during the week, and I'd run down to Washington to see my two children, Sister and Buzz, and visit with friends and talk to the president occasionally, and then I'd go back to New York on Sunday night.
Right, and in June 1933, I think you got your divorce, or at least...
Well, Anna went to Reno in June of 33, and with Katie and Sister and Buzz, I went up to visit my very good old friends, Willis Wilmot and his mother and father at Plum Lake, Wisconsin. We were up there for about 6 weeks. And in the meantime, I recall that I felt I should like to have a pistol permit because it's a kind of rough country, and the late J. Edgar Hoover personally gave me a pistol permit. But Charlie Rich went along with him, with us at that time, and he was a member of the FBI that helped me out, too, just in case.
What is your present situation so far as your marriage and your children? And I know that you're a grandfather, and you do have children from Anna Roosevelt. What is that situation today?
Well, Sister and Buzz, of course, have grown up and out in the wide world, and after Anna and I parted company very gently, about 6 years later, I married Catherine Miller Lees of Haverford, Pennsylvania, and we have 4 children and we have 4 grandchildren, which I'm very proud of. And we see them occasionally here, not as often as we would like.
Going back to our earlier conversations, Colonel, can you tell us about the time when you bowed out as a member of the family? Could you expound more on that?
Well, I think I know what you're driving at, Dr. BETER. Yes, I always maintained very friendly relationship with FDR, and he with me for very valid reasons. We were always good friends, although I did not agree with a number of his political observations and leanings. But I will say this, that his mother thought very well of me, and I was still one of her 3 trustees, along with his uncle, Mr. Frederick A. Delano, and himself. And so we had reasons to be close friends, but I was so shocked that I can hardly describe it when I found out later on of his role in bringing on World War II and the Pearl Harbor attack. That was really devastating to me.
Did you get any hint of any change in the character of FDR?
Oh, I think that's a very interesting question. Yes, I certainly did, because he was a certain type of individual. He's ambitious to do something better. But when he did arrive at that point, and you must remember that he was crippled, he became difficult in this respect. He was not only ambitious, very vain, but he was completely handled on important things of international monetary matters and important social matters by his advisors. So actually he was a perfect foil for them, and that was very dismaying to me, having known him in brighter former years.
Did they try to build him up and say, you should be the president of the world, if I may say?
I think that idea was thrown out to him, that if he did thus and so, if he created another war and they got into an international situation, he was the logical man, certainly not Winston Churchill or anybody in Europe. He was the logical man to be the first president of the world, and I think that flattered his vanity.
Colonel, I can't help but feel that we have another scenario here in Woodrow Wilson, in that they were telling Wilson, too, in those days, that he was going to be the great white father on the great white horse to save the world. You remember those principles?
Yes, I sure do. I think that's a good point. Woodrow Wilson was the tool of the international bankers and the international ideologists, and so was FDR. There was a great deal of similarity between the two of them. Of course, the internationalists had made a great deal of money from the period of World War I, out of World War I, up into World War II, so it was a very much more serious situation and more valuable to them when FDR was put into the White House by them.
I see another link from Woodrow Wilson to President Roosevelt and to Nelson Rockefeller when he becomes president, if he does become president under his scenario. And if he does become president under his new balance, we've had the New Deal, the Fair Deal. Now we're going to have the New Balance, and I understand he's going to start really campaigning on February the 19th at opening a gun here in Washington at the National Press Club, and he's going to speak on some very controversial subjects. It seems now that the member of this international tribe is now going to come forth. This is their third attempt. This is their third time at bat. And if he makes a home run, it seems to me that the American people are out.
Are what?
Are out. That is, the American people are going to suffer. They are now going to get their merging of American life into that of the Soviet Union. Now, I'm trying to set the stage here, Colonel, very quickly so that we can go into more substance later on, as if we haven't had enough substance so far. We have. We want to get your opinions on really the things that took place during this period. It's a very important period, and also to pierce the veil that many of the American people have not been able to do for so many years, because you were an intimate part of this family. And speaking of the family again, could you tell us a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt, who you referred to in your book as Mama?
As Mama, I called her. And she was a very interesting, colorful lady, as you well know. At the time when I first knew her, though, she was very quiet, and she was in the background largely at our mother-in-law's house at Hyde Park. But she was a very gracious hostess and helped her mother-in-law and her husband. She wanted him to retain his political status at that time and maintain his many friends, whereas his mother, Mrs. James Roosevelt, whom I will in the future refer to in this interview as Granny, She wanted her son to take it easy and retire and lead the life of a country gentleman in his semi-crippled condition. He had a very old, fine old Hudson River estate there, and her house had been remodeled, and they had a very large, great room added on one end, which is very colorful, full of books, and a very big fireplace, and FDR had a desk to the left of that fireplace, which was the desk, I believe, that Wilson used on the George Washington when he went abroad. I can remember one time when we were talking there, and we were looking at this picture that hung over the fireplace there. It was a picture of Isaac Roosevelt, and he was in semi-colonial garb, very interesting, and I was looking at it, and he was looking at it too, and he says, "Kurt, you know, that old boy was a pretty sharp tack." And I said, "Yes, I guess he was." He said, "If you and I were to do any business with him, we certainly ought to have kept our overcoats or our coats buttoned." And he laughed, and I thought that was a pretty good joke about it, one of his ancestors.
Were there any close neighbors of importance around Granny's estate, Colonel?
Well, I'd say, Dr. BETER, that she was surrounded by very important neighbors. In particular, I can refer to the Archibald Rogers. Mr. Rogers was one of the original members of the Standard Oil Group, and he gave many a fine New Year's Eve party. I attended several, and we used to play hockey on his ice pond.
When you lived near the estate of Pocantico Hills, where the Rockefellers lived, did you ever have occasion to see Nelson Rockefeller?
Oh, yes, we were good friends, and we were friends of his family there, and occasionally I would go over there and play tennis with him. And I recall one time when we were playing tennis, and then we were invited, Anna and I were invited for dinner at his grandfather's house. And that was, were about 14 people, as I remember it, and his grandfather was a most interesting gentleman. He was in upper years, but he had a most alert look. His eyes had a very piercing look, and he was extremely bright, I would say. For some reason or other, I don't know, but I was sitting on his right during the dinner, and at the close of the dinner, we played a little game, which was Mr. Rockefeller's favorite game, called Numerica.
That's an unusual name. Could you tell us about that game?
And it was a very, very simple little numbers game, something like bingo. And at the conclusion of the game, the butler came in and carried out the little cards, and I turned to Mr. Rockefeller and said, "Mr. Rockefeller, this is a very, very interesting game, very interesting indeed." He smiled at me, and he cleared his throat, sort of like that, and everybody, of course, stopped talking. And down on the other end of the table was his housekeeper, Mrs. Evans, a very attractive lady, up in years, but she looked after the old gentleman. And he cleared his throat, sort of, everybody stopped talking, and he said, "Yes, Mr. Dall, Numerica is a very, very interesting and very fine game, the fine points of which I learned as a small boy at the knee of Mrs. Evans." And everybody roared with laughter because that made her out to be about 150 years old. It was a very interesting dinner, I can assure you that.
Getting back to the political phase, Colonel, can you tell us when FDR began to get back into the political arena?
I would say that about 1927, Dr. BETER. His health was improving in respect to the movement of his legs, and his wife was very active in helping him rebuild his fences politically. And Al Smith came into the picture, and together with Al Smith and some of his friends, why, he not only helped Al Smith, but in turn Al Smith helped him. And I would say that's where the political star of FDR began to arise, about 1927 to 28, and then FDR was finally elected governor of New York State.
Did Granny and Eleanor, his wife, have any part of this?
Well, his wife did, but Granny didn't enter into it very much, except that she entertained some of the many people that came to her house. And sometimes she was a little upset when there'd be 20 people for dinner, and she didn't know anything except there was going to be 6.
So did she take to politics as such? Or
She wasn't particularly fond of politics, but her daughter-in-law, Eleanor Roosevelt, was, and she was a very gracious and very real help to FDR at that time.
You once told me a story about Al Smith and his platoon. Would you share it with our listeners?
Dr. Beter, that's a funny story, really. In serious politics, Al Smith was coming from Albany on his way to New York, and Al was governor at that time. And he was stopped off to see Franklin for luncheon at Granny's house at Hyde Park on the way to New York. And Al Smith used to chew a cigar down to the butt, and he'd use a spittoon a lot. And when Granny didn't have a spittoon, a big brass spittoon in her big living room. So the problem came as, what are we going to do when Al Smith gets down to the end of his cigar? Well, Tom Lynch, who was quite a politician in Poughkeepsie, solved the problem, and he came up with a very bright, shiny spittoon there, and that solved and saved the day, so Al Smith and nobody else was embarrassed.
Well, Colonel, what was it like to be around FDR during the days when he was governor in Albany, New York?
Well, Dr. Beter, I only went up there occasionally because we had plenty going on Wall Street. We were at the bottom of a depression there. But the executive house in those days at Albany was very grim and very gloomy. FDR had to have a special elevator put in there so he could get up and down. And I never particularly enjoyed going up to Albany on account of those circumstances.
I see, but what was the atmosphere around there during the days of the stock market crash?
Where, in Wall Street?
No, there at Albany.
Well, they didn't reflect that very much, so they were largely engrossed in the political aspects of the situation.
Do you think that the plans were laid during that time for President Roosevelt to become president?
A little bit later on, I would say, this is a guess, I would say about 1929 and 30. I think at that time some of the important people in New York began to feel that FDR was a potential candidate, and I further feel that he went along with some of their major objectives, and I mentioned people like Raskob, John Raskob, Al Smith, Bernard Baruch, Felix Frankfurter, Joe Kennedy, and others. I was on the floor of the stock exchange at that time. Not only on Wall Street, I was right in the middle of it.
What firm were you with then?
I was with a New York firm of O'Brien, Potter, and Stafford, at which I was a managing partner, as I had left Lehman Brothers with their blessing about a year before. It was a very poor time to leave, but I made that move in 1929, which is a very expensive one for me. But I was a member of the New York Stock Exchange at that time, and on the floor, October the 24th, the day of the big crash.
I have been alerting my listeners that the same thing has been happening recently to the stock market as in 1929. Could you expound more fully on the stock market? Do you see any similarities today with that of yesterday?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, Dr. Beter, accurately. Let me refer to my views of what happened in 1929. We had gone through a great period of expansion, a deliberate expansion, and then the big international world powers decided that it was time to cut their melon. And so they withdrew credit very suddenly in Wall Street in October. And on October 29th, brokers' loans went up very much, and credit was withdrawn. Gold was shipped out of the country prior thereto, and therefore there was a credit panic, and stock prices plummeted. There were many suicides. It was a very difficult, dangerous time. I remember that Winston Churchill came over here and appeared on the balcony of the stock exchange to see the turmoil, but obviously he must have had some pre-knowledge of this situation because he was a very close friend of Bernard Baruch, who knew the score. And I remember him appearing in the balcony, and nobody paid any attention to them because they were wondering whether they were alive or dead financially.
Weren't there some false starts and false beginnings?
There was a false beginning, Dr. Beter, about the middle of September, but that was merely the testing out of the market. Just like today, the market is being tested in a highly political market today, but in those days it was manipulated, to my knowledge, by the international powers. Now, whether they're doing that today on a super on a super type of operation, I don't know, but it certainly looks that way. It looks that way because there's a very real drive to put us into a internationally controlled one world government, which the American people certainly do not want to be put into, but they are highly unalerted to the danger.
Getting back to the political picture, how about the Chicago Convention? Did you attend that?
Yes, I attended that as a volunteer. Louis Howe didn't want me to go out there at all because he thought I'd mess things up. But I assured him that I wouldn't open my mouth politically, but just go there as a loyal supporter of my then father-in-law. I went out there on my own, and I had a very amusing experience there.
Could you tell us about it?
Well, Dr. BETER, I didn't know anything about politics in those days, not that I know much about it now, but at the same time I was out there, and an old friend of mine named Tom K. Smith from St. Louis was with the Prendergast group, and they were pushing their Missouri candidate. And I said, Tom, what are you doing up here? And he said, oh, I'm up here just trying to push for Senator Rankin. I said, well, you're wasting your time. Me bluffing 100%, but just talking out of the corner of my mouth. Oh, he said no. He said no. He said, we got to do that. And he said, I got to go to a meeting down there in a hotel right now. I'll see you later. So I said, where are you going? And he mentioned the name of a hotel nearby, and I decided I'd go up there too. He said, no, don't you come over here, Curtis. This is dangerous. No, I said, I'm coming over there. I have a message from Mr. Prendergast. And so I went over there. I got in a cab. And, in 5 minutes I was there. I walked down the hall there, and there was a fellow standing out in front of this big door there, loaded with hardware. And he said, what do you want? And I said, I want to speak to Mr. Prendergast. He said, what do you want to speak to him about? I said, that's my business. So he opened the door, and pretty soon Mr. Prendergast poked his head. I said, what do you want, young man? I said, Mr. Prendergast, I'm with the Roosevelt delegation, and if you really want to get on the bandwagon early, you better get on the Roosevelt bandwagon right away. He said, when I need your advice, young man, I will let you know. And the door slammed in my face, and the guard thumbed in my direction, and I moved away and went back to the hotel.
And talking about Prendergast always brings to mind, Colonel, the name of Harry Truman. Do you think that he was in that room, too?
I couldn't sign an affidavit to that effect, but I'll bet you a red apple that he was in that room, because you've heard about the smoke-filled rooms, and after all, that wasn't child's play. That was the real McCoy going on, and Prendergast was cracking the whip, and I feel quite positive he was in there, although I know I had the pleasure of meeting the later President Harry Truman. When I left that hall at the suggestion of the guard, I went back to the hotel and bought a newspaper, went up to my room and walked in there, and then what do you think happened when I walked into the room, Dr. BETER? The telephone was ringing, and Tom K. Smith's voice was on the other end of it. He says, Kurt, something has happened. I said, what's happened? He says, the Missouri delegation is going for Roosevelt early in the ball game. I said, nice work, Tom, old boy. And later on, he was promoted to be president of the bank. How do you like that?
And, of course, Colonel, Roosevelt went on to win the nomination. Did anything happen after that nomination?
Well, I think a very significant thing happened. On his way back, he, for some reason, instead of flying back to New York, he stopped off in Massachusetts to have a conference with Emmanuel House up there and others of the Woodrow Wilson regime and some of the high Democratic Party chieftains. And I have a feeling that some of his most important directives were given to him at that time. He went on later on in November to win the election, you may recall.
Right. Was that, that's a very important point, Colonel.
Yes, I think so, too.
Was that at Magnolia Beach?
At Magnolia, Mass., as near as I can, tell it. It was at the home of Emmanuel House, who was very much in retirement, but he was still very important with the powers that be in the Democratic Party.
Right. Now, was Louis Howe there?
Oh, yes. Very definitely.
Well, how do you link him up? You know, President Woodrow Wilson had his Colonel Emmanuel House. How would you compare him with Louis Howe as far as capability?
That's a good question. That's a very good question, Dr. BETER. I would say that Emmanuel House, who became the so-called alter ego of President Woodrow Wilson, and Louis McHenry Howe in many ways occupied similar slots in the political machine. Both were advisors to their respective mentors, or shall I say bosses. Yet at the same time, both of them had intimate connection with the people who put up the money for the Democratic Party.
And FDR went on to get elected, as you know, as a result of the Depression.
I've heard of that.
Colonel, could you give us the atmosphere that prevailed in the country during that time? You know, at the present time, we're hearing about bank failures all over the country. It seems to me that the same scenario is being repeated here in America. Can you expound on the feelings at that time?
Dr. BETER, I think your observation is a very interesting one. The scenario is about to be repeated. In those days, of course, I knew a lot about it. And I went out of my way along about the middle of November, noticing that Mr. Hoover was trying to get a degree of cooperation from the Democratic hierarchy to collaborate with them on some formula to save a lot of these banks that were failing. I would say up to 10,000, Dr. BETER,
yes,
round figures, failed in the United States. You won't believe what I'm telling you. The Democratic hierarchy did not want to do anything with the Republican machine in Washington because they wanted the banks to fail, because their financial advisors wanted to buy those banks in at the very bottom, and that was a terrible thing. And thousands of people lost their deposits, and thousands of these banks went out of business. And I couldn't get the Democratic machine to move. They wanted to wait and wait and wait and let the thing go to the rock bottom, and then in late March to have the thing come back there and have FDR look like he was the White Knight.
Well, apparently the same scenario is being repeated today with Nelson Rockefeller.
That I don't know, but there are certain signs that are very ominous to me on the horizon.
Now we're down to March the 4th, 1933 in Washington on the inauguration day.
Yeah, a cold, bleak day it was.
Could you describe that day to us?
Oh, I can remember it very vividly. It was, I will never forget that day, never. We started out early in the morning when everybody was a little nervous and jittery. We had to attend a religious service at the Episcopal Church, St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington. And as the cavalcade of cars, I was in the third car, past the hotel near the church. Out on the balcony was a friend of mine named Freddie Peabody, who had a high hat on and had been celebrating all the night before at a big party. And when he saw me in the third car there, he hollered out there from this balcony and broke the tension. He says, "Kurt, what are you doing down there in that car all dressed up like Astor's horse?" And I said, "Freddie, be careful, you'll fall off that fire escape." Well, everybody laughed and it broke the tension. So he went in and had this church service there prior to the inauguration, and then up on the hill, FDR went up there and was duly sworn in with the Hoover family standing by there looking very, very quiet, and Hoover looked very tired. I can understand that. Then later on, they had the inaugural parade. And long about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I went out there with my little daughter, Sister. It was very cold, and I thought I'd like to see the cavalry go by, as I was always interested in cavalry. And I approached the inauguration stand, and much to my surprise, I might even say dismay, there was nobody there from the White House with General Douglas MacArthur, who was reviewing the troops. And I thought that was a great slight to the distinguished general.
Why wasn't President Roosevelt there viewing the
Well, that's a good question.
Parade?
I think the president had a legitimate reason for not being there, because he had steel braces on his legs, which in that cold day would reflect the cold, and he couldn't stand up for an hour and a half. So therefore, it was my opinion that Jimmy or Johnny or Elliot or Franklin Jr., one of them should most certainly have been there to be with the general and fill in for their father, who could not stand the cold. But as I had my daughter with me, I watched it to the conclusion of the parade, and then I went back to the White House and went up to the room. I had the yellow room at that time. That was the first room on the left as you go up the stairs. And a very amusing thing happened. If you want to hear about that, I'd be glad to tell you.
What went on there?
Well, you will recall that they generally had a famous tea in the White House at 4 o'clock. And people from all over the country, particularly ladies, come from long distance to attend the tea party. Well, when I went in there about 3:30, it was a very cold day, as I say, and a friend of mine, who was the head of the International Business Machine Company, Tom Watson. Tom Watson had given me a case of Haig and Haig pinched Scotch whiskey. And I said, well, Mr. Watson, I have no political influence, but he said, oh, well, you're a nice fellow, you might as well have that. Well, everybody in the White House knew that I'd had this package because it had to be opened on account of everybody had to open up package, so everybody knew I had some hair tonic upstairs there in that yellow room. Pretty soon my friends dropped in, and then I had friends of friends, and pretty soon friends of friends of friends dropped in, and pretty soon I had 78 people in that yellow room. And everybody was having a good time. I started out with asking for 6 glasses, and I ended up with a whole lot more. And when the party was really going strong, about 10 after 4, I got a note from the White House usher, who was a very tall, distinguished man. A note was on this silver tray, and I opened it and read it. And it read as follows, and I wish I'd kept it. It's wonderful, wonderful souvenir. Dear Kurt, will you please stop dispensing largesse? I cannot start the White House tea. Signed, Eleanor Roosevelt. So, therefore, tea emerged victorious.
I see. Well, it's a very beautiful picture you painted there, Colonel. But what was Tom Watson doing there?
Well, I don't know. He's a very important businessman, and, you know, they were going to close the banks, and I got private information that they were going to shut the banks, and I told him that. Oh, he said, my Godfrey, Curtis, he says, I've got a big bill over at the Mayflower Hotel. He says, I've got to go over there and get $500. Are you sure the banks are going to be closed? Now, yes, Mr. Watson, that's what I've been told. He says, thanks very much. I go over there and pay my bill, and I need $500. I said, well, Mr. Watson, you better go ahead and do it in a hurry. He says, I'm going to do it. Thank you very much, Curtis.
Well, that was very important information, Colonel. How did you come by that information?
Well, I was told that the banks were going to be closed by inside people there in the White House. That was the program there. They're going to close the banks for 2 or 3 days and they'll shuffle things around. In the meantime, the insiders can line up and buy some of the assets at a very cheap price at some of these closed banks.
Now, in 1934, we had the Congress ratify President Roosevelt's executive orders whereby he pegged the gold at $35 an ounce and also confirmed the illegal nationalization, if you please, of the people's property, that is gold, in 1933. Can you tell us what the atmosphere was around the signing or the passing of the gold bill in January 1934?
At that time, Dr. BETER, I was fairly naive with the political background there, but some of my more well-informed friends were furious and dismayed at Roosevelt's apparent perfidy in respect to the people of the United States to withdraw their gold, which he didn't have a right to do, and then turn that gold, so I am told, over to the Federal Reserve Bank without a receipt. Now, the Louis T. McFadden knows a lot about that, and anybody who wants to know more about it can look up and see what he had to say about that deal.
I have looked it up, Colonel. In January 1934, the gold bill was passed. Congressman Louis T. McFadden, who was chairman of the Banking and Currency Committee for 22 years, made a tremendous speech, and it was printed in the Congressional Record January 24, 1934. It was on the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, and I want to read some portion of it because I believe it's very pertinent at this point.
I think it's very pertinent, too. Please do, Dr. BETER.
I want to quote from Congressman McFadden at this point. Quote, you see, Mr. Chairman, under this bill, the United States Treasury has to pay for the gold. Although the gold belongs to the people and was taken away from their bank deposits and their cash registers and their pocketbooks in the first place and put into the Federal Reserve banks And although the Federal Reserve banks tricked and fooled the people into giving it to them for the Federal Reserve currency, which they now refuse to redeem, and although that gold does not belong to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks, the United States Treasury has to pay the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks for it. Well, how does this bill propose to pay the Federal Reserve outfit? How does this bill provide that the government shall take over the stolen goods? It provides that the United States government shall give the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks new gold certificates to the full value of the loot. The gold certificates will give the Federal Reserve banks and the Federal Reserve Board legal title to this gold.
That's incredible, Dr. BETER. That's incredible.
This is absolutely the way it reads. The legal title to this gold, and the United States Treasury will be nothing more than its physical custodian. The Secretary of the Treasury, who was Henry Morgenthau, Jr. at that time, will give the Federal Reserve banks gold for their new gold certificates whenever they ask for it. It is a fraudulent transfer. And I continue. When the individual citizens of the United States were required to surrender their gold, they were required to surrender their gold certificates as well as their gold coin and bullion. The Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks are private corporations, but they did not obey the gold orders. They did not surrender any gold coin, gold certificates, or gold bullion. On the contrary, the gold which was commandeered from the people was given to them as a free gift. And now, after they have taken into their possession all the gold belonging to the people, they are ready to make a pretended transfer of that gold to the government. Evidently, there is a law for the common man and no law for the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks." Unquote.
Dr. BETER, how in the world can the Treasury Department give the people's gold to the Federal Reserve Bank?
It was all done illegally years ago, and as I have brought out recently in my audio tapes and audio books, this gold has now been transferred to the manipulators abroad. Do you feel that there was a plan as far back as 1943 and even as far back as 1933 to take the gold out of Fort Knox? Would you put that past your father-in-law?
Well, Dr. BETER, I think it was obvious to anybody to see the efforts of the financial powers that be to reduce the gold standard back of the Federal Reserve notes from 40% first, then down to 25%, and then lower. And then on the face of the bills, why there was a reduction of the redeemability of those bills progressively. And it was obvious to me that the reason that that was taking place, and this was long before I had the pleasure of reading some of your very interesting comments recently in the last year on the Fort Knox situation specifically, it was obvious to me that there was not the gold reserve in Fort Knox that the Treasury Department purported, because the redeemability feature was being consecutively reduced. And the question is why? Why were they doing that? Because the gold wasn't there. I mean, it was just as simple as that. Anybody was reasonably informed on money, and I am.
Well, the intelligence community has informed me on many occasions that the gold is gone, that our figures, our balance sheets of the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, are fictitious. What I want to ask you, Colonel, is was the atmosphere so deceitful that they could plan the taking away of the gold?
Well, I think the atmosphere was very deceitful, Dr. BETER, way back there, and it disturbed me a great deal at the time. Not that I knew many of the specific details, but the atmosphere was a program to change our way of life in this country, and that included, I think, a dilution of the gold reserve behind our dollar at that time. Now, obviously, FDR didn't dream that up. Somebody told him to do that. And who told him to do that? My guess is that the important hierarchy of the international money boys in New York told him to do that through Henry Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White, his assistant.
Harry Dexter White, did you know anything about him?
Yes, I know some things about him. He was put in there to hold up Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury, because Henry's knowledge of finance was very superficial, as his father often commented. Harry Dexter White was this very erudite, very smart operator that was close to the international boys who told Henry what to do. And he was charged with activities which bordered treason. And before he was supposed to appear before the Senate to answer these charges, he had a heart attack, according to the newspapers, and purportedly died. Some people doubt that.
So those people who did hold gold and did not turn it in, because under the Federal Gold Reserve Act of 1934, those people who had the gold outside the continental United States or in the Philippines, they could bring their gold back and get $35 an ounce, while the peasants, that is us, who turned in our gold, we only got $20 an ounce. Now, they made a whopping profit there. So why couldn't
That's right.
So why couldn't they continue making enormous profits at the expense of the American people?
Well, I think that's a very plausible suggestion.
If the government is corrupt, our money will be corrupt.
That's right. That's right.
This brings me back to something that you told me earlier about the fact that Henry Morgenthau, Jr. was told to come down here and perform a service. In other words, he was supposed to come down here and follow orders. Whose orders, Colonel Dall? I'm asking you now for the record, whose orders do you think Henry Morgenthau, Jr. was following?
I think he very definitely followed the orders from the hierarchy of the New York international bankers, Dr. BETER, and I think he admitted that very open-mindedly, as Henry Morgenthau really didn't know what was going on.
And here we have a man who was our Secretary of Treasury.
Well, he was put in there for that specific purpose. He was just a puppet.
And this was during the most perilous days of our republic?
One of our most perilous days. We're perilous days today.
May I ask this? Do you believe that the Treasury Department is still in the clutches of these same people who then were able to take away the people's gold and now have it within their own pockets?
I think the situation is a very similar one, Dr. BETER.
So times have not changed?
I don't think they've changed a bit. In fact, I think they may have worsened.